I'm Professor Elaine Casket. I'm honored to be speaking to Congreso Futuro from London. I wish I could be physically present, but am pleased to be digitally together with you. If you've experienced the death of someone close, you know the pain of loss. Few experiences in life affect us so much. It's hard to accept the silence and the end of the interaction, to come to terms with not being able to touch or hear or see them again. So, is it any surprise that when new ways of communicating are invented, in our grief and our longing, we try to use these technologies to connect with the dead? In 19th century America, there were some famous young sisters who had seances to speak to the dead. And the spirits communicated by rapping, just like the telegraph tapped. When photography was invented, you could go to a special studio and pay to have a photo with your deceased loved one materializing like a cloud next to you or behind you. Writing in Scientific American in 1920, Thomas Edison himself said he hoped one day he could develop a recording device sensitive enough to capture the voices of the dead from the Great War. And on a hill overlooking the sea in Japan today sits an old fashioned telephone booth, and it connects to nothing. Itaru Sasaki built it to communicate with his dead cousin, and he called it the wind telephone. And after the 2011 tsunami, people from all over Japan started to travel there so they could speak to their dead on this phone. With today's technologies, it's easier to reach the dead because they're not just tools. The dead live in the tech already, in the accounts and the devices. It's like a digital limbo, somewhere between heaven and earth, the place where the dead stay until someone figures out where they belong. This is, of course, not true for everyone in the world, but for those of us with smartphones and smartwatches and internet access, for the connected ones on the privileged side of the digital divide, we build extraordinary digital reflections in our lifetimes. Those reflections don't just disappear when we die. Through default or design, the modern dead stay in their social networks. The blogs of the dead stay up until the web hosting bills stop being paid. The websites remain at least until the domain name passes to someone else or expires. The email accounts of the dead linger unless someone has passwords or digital executor permissions, the knowledge of how to close them, or the awareness the accounts are there at all. Air miles and loyalty points and cryptocurrencies of the dead may hang around in their accounts, unspent, unaccessed. And the contacts of the dead stay in our phones and their messages in our message threads. The theme of this year's Congreso Futuro is learning to coexist. And the part of the digital age we're currently living through is about learning to coexist with the dead online. The online dead are not confined to some separate digital place. We encounter them everywhere we go in our digital spheres, whether we intend to or not. Even if we could track down every scrap of data relating to a deceased person, which is nearly impossible, we're reluctant to delete them. And the social media companies that control so much of our data, they seem reluctant to delete them too. Now, in the absence of other formal instruction, for example, Facebook memorialized profiles by default, keeping them available. And if Facebook continues to grow, by 2100, there will be 4.9 billion profiles of the deceased on the site, far more than living users. It will be the world's largest digital cemetery and funeral director. Its business model will have changed significantly because dead people don't click on ads. I'm a psychologist, and I'm the author of All the Ghosts in the Machine, the digital afterlife of your personal data. I've spent the last 17 years studying life, death, and bereavement online, and I've tracked the evolution in how social media and other online companies deal with death. When those evolutions happen, sometimes there are news stories or press releases with headlines like making it easier to honor a loved one on Facebook after they pass away. Now, that piece, which appeared on Facebook's newsroom page in April 2019, explained that Facebook had done extensive research on what people needed, so Facebook was now implementing ways of reducing people's pain, including the use of AI to prevent the kinds of things they thought bereaved people might find emotionally difficult. It's as though bit by bit, the technosphere is trying to solve for the pain of loss. And by retaining deceased people's information and making it available, they say they're seeking to help you in your grief. On one hand, you could say, that's a wonderful thing. At any time, from anywhere, you can access these memories, the images, words of someone you loved and lost. You can visit and talk to them and send messages, as many grieving people do, sometimes feeling like there's still a thread of connection there, like maybe the dead will actually hear you. And this isn't so strange. We're accustomed to sending messages into the ether all the time and assuming they'll be received, even if people don't answer back. Why would that sense disappear completely when a person dies? But social media platforms weren't conceptualized or designed as memorial or legacy platforms, and there are some problems here. First, the privacy rights of living users are protected by law, but the dead don't have the same rights. And to a large extent, companies can do whatever they want with the data of users no longer living. But when the dead stay in their social networks, their data can be used in ways that are profitable for those companies to gain insights about living users. Second, deepfake, AI, hacking technologies are increasing in sophistication. They're becoming more accessible. When deceased persons' data is compromised, others, living others, are practically and emotionally vulnerable. I've communicated with multiple individuals who have been friend requested by their dead parent or sibling or friend thanks to profile cloners. And there are many ways a deceased person's data can be exploited for criminal purposes, which is why perhaps names and dates of death can be bought with Bitcoin on the dark web. Third, think about the environmental cost of all the excess data of the deceased, much of it utterly unimportant to history, heating up the world's servers. And for those of you who have fantasies of continuing in avatar form after you die, perhaps an artificially intelligent entity, consider the massive carbon footprint of training an AI like that. Look in the mirror and consider, do you feel important enough to history to justify doing that? What purposes warrant our keeping a particular person, their personality, or their body of knowledge or talent alive indefinitely? Suddenly, leaving deceased people's information in the ownership and control of these companies doesn't seem like such a good idea. But what would a disappearing social media profile do to the bereaved? Once, Facebook deleted profiles upon death. And then there was a mass shooting on our university campus in the US in 2007, and the bereaved petitioned Facebook not to delete the profiles of the lost, to memorialize them. When I interviewed a Facebook representative about this history of deletion, he said that delete upon death policy at Facebook was horrible. And I have no doubt that it was experienced as horrible by many bereaved. But does that mean that it was the right thing to do to start keeping the profiles there? All things considered, maybe these companies should be rejecting responsibility for maintaining the data of the deceased. Maybe they should never have started memorializing this material, because if they had rejected this idea, it might have helped prevent us from reaching where we are now. We're now in a situation where we are storing all of our valuable information in such a way that we do not own it, cannot control it, sometimes cannot access it, and access these days is 9/10 of the law. Slowly, our expectations have been shaped towards assuming our information and our loved ones' material will be preserved by these sites, like online really is forever. In fact, we've started to assume that it's their job to keep it, their ethical and moral responsibility. And as with so much else in our modern lives, we're unshouldering responsibility from ourselves onto these platforms. We task Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and other sites to look after our stuff, and we ask them to care for us in our grief, to look after us emotionally. We saw this expectation in the backlash against Twitter's planned cull of inactive accounts, which was back in November, December 2019. Twitter said, "We'll shortly be deleting inactive accounts," which included the unused accounts of the dead. People in mourning cried out in protest, and Twitter changed its mind right away and said that instead they would start to memorialize accounts. I believe this to be the wrong way. This perceived emotional, moral responsibility to preserve the dead and to make them indefinitely accessible. Now that's one of the many threads in the ropes that bind us to these platforms. It's one pillar of a dependent or codependent relationship. Grief is an extremely private and unique experience. It's entirely one's own. Each bereavement is as unique as the relationship you had with that person in life. You know, on Data Privacy Day in 2020, Facebook put up an article in its newsroom. It was called "Starting the Decade by Giving You More Control Over Your Privacy." Giving. You cannot give something that you don't have, that's not in your power to gift. And if a social media platform can hand you control over your privacy, over your choices, it must possess that control already. If Facebook are really serious about trying to restore some of what they've taken away, maybe releasing control of the data of the deceased, maybe it should form part of that. But you might ask, wouldn't that affect people's grief if that material wasn't there? I recently wrote a piece with my colleague, Dr. Morna O'Connor. She's a fellow scholar of death in the digital, and in it we addressed 3 dead grief concepts that are being revived in the digital age, partly to do with the central role of technology companies, including social media. One dead grief concept is that there is a normal or healthy or ideal way of grieving, and that's not supported by research. The second dead grief concept is the idea that technology helps or hinders grief. But when you accept the first principle that there is no right way of grieving, what does helping or hindering even mean? And the third dead grief concept is that we should do something about technology's supposed impact on grief. So we blame technology companies and we call them to action to do the right things. And some of those companies, although not many, have teams dedicated to trying to lessen the pain to the bereaved. As I mentioned, in 2019, Facebook announced it's making it easier to honor a loved one on Facebook after they pass away. And they were updating their handling and management of dead users' profiles. So they announced new AI to identify profiles of dead users before they're memorialized to, quote, help keep it from showing up in places that might cause distress, like recommending that person be invited to events or sending a birthday reminder to their friends. On the one hand, Facebook is trying to recognize and respond to the wishes and insights of individual mourners. But when they say they hope to minimize experiences that might be painful, they assume that automated reminders of the dead cause intolerable pain to all grievers and that pain must be designed out. And it's their responsibility to do so and in their power to do so. Should it be the role of social media companies to design and then impose the frames in which your mourning or remembering for a particular person happens? Should those companies determine who's remembered, how they're remembered, by whom? And so far, that's what's happening because our legal and regulatory landscape that determines what happens to deceased people's data, it's allowing it to happen. So social media companies have a lot of power in maintaining, preserving, designing, shaping digital remains. And because these are for-profit companies, it's a little like asking the fox to look after your precious chickens. It's not a great job for him. Change has been slow, partly because it's complicated. There are so many legal areas involved, but it also hasn't been a clear priority yet. But the citizens of the digital age are starting to die in greater numbers. The complexities of the dead and the living coexisting online are beginning to be felt. Some see a utopian future as an existence without pain and suffering. And techno utopianists believe technology can help us get there. But how can we have a utopia without love? And how can we allow ourselves to love without simultaneously opening ourselves to loss? Death is part of our human existence. We've been coping with loss since the dawn of time. Is grief really a problem for artificial intelligence to solve? Thank you.